Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Great Room at the RSA for Revolutionary Russia with Orlando 5Gs. I'm Viv Groskop. I'm a journalist, broadcaster and a judge of this year's Pushkin House Prize for Russian non-fiction. Really delighted to welcome you to today's special event. Just before we begin, could I ask you to switch off any mobile phones or turn them to silent? We are live streaming this event, so welcome to all of our web viewers, and a reminder to everyone that the hashtag is #PelicanBooks if you want to get involved in the discussion on Twitter. Housekeeping notices over. Great pleasure to be chairing this event today. As you may have read recently, there's been a bit of buzz surrounding the relaunch of Penguin's iconic Pelican imprint, the groundbreaking series that first appeared in the 1930s and helped democratise knowledge by offering quality introductory guides to essential topics for the general reader, and all for the price of a packet of cigarettes. For the final event of this special event series celebrating the rebirth of Pelicans, we are delighted to be joined by Orlando 5Gs. Orlando teaches history at Birkbeck, University of London, and is the author of many acclaimed books on Russian history, including A People's Tragedy, Natasha's Dance, The Whisperers, Crimea, and now his new offering for Pelican, An Introduction to Revolutionary Russia, 1891 to 1991. Orlando will be delivering a short lecture before joining me briefly in conversation, and then we'll be opening up to audience questions. So delighted to have you today, Orlando. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Orlando 5Gs.
Thank you, Viv. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a wonderful location. It's also sort of slightly surprising to be talking about the Russian Revolution in the context of what's happening today. It's come back to bite us a little bit. As Viv said, I also wrote a book on the Crimean War, which, when it came out, no one paid much attention to it. The Crimean War seemed ancient history. And then when all the Crimean crisis kicked off, I was really amused by a tweet I saw. Someone had tweeted, Crimea trending for the first time since 1854. So it feels a little bit like that, revisiting the Russian Revolution, because for a long time it almost seems to be sort of forgotten about it. We packed it away. We thought we'd done and dusted that one. Communism was over. The Russian problem was over. We looked to the former Soviet states as sort of emerging democracies. For a while we thought maybe Russia might be one of them, but we soon gave up on that. But then when Putin emerged with his authoritarian reinvention of the Russian Revolution, if you like, we thought, well, that doesn't really matter, it's not part of Europe anyway. But now, of course, we realize that its policies are very much of importance to Europe and to the neighbouring states of Russia. So I'm going to return to that, and I'm sure we will want to discuss that. And I do think that there is an important legacy of the Russian Revolution to be highlighted in terms of Russia's sense of itself, Russia's domestic and foreign policies under Putin. But as I said, it felt for a long time that the revolution had gone away. And when I thought about writing a concise history of it, which I must confess wasn't originally conceived as a book for Pelican, but when I wrote it, it then sort of turned into a Pelican. And at that point, it seemed rather hard to think about ways of reviving the subject for a new generation. I mean, as I say, since '91, the subject academically had somewhat languished. Many people had abandoned Soviet studies, as it used to be called, and fled into other areas because it seemed that that intellectual sort of heritage had completely disappeared forever. Some sort of, I would call them Soviet apologists, had reinvented themselves in other forms, some still around today, using the same ideas and same emotional impulses to support Putin. Others had chosen other subjects, and so on. But it always seemed to me that actually this isn't something that's going to be going away, and we have to find new ways of reviving it. And as time passed, I sort of thought, well, it's time to sort of draw a line under my own work in some ways on the Russian Revolution. So I've sort of gone on about it for quite a while, and as Viv said, written probably too many books on the subject. I thought, well, how am I going to draw that line? And writing it as I did a couple of years ago, I thought, at the end of a long period of teaching a course on it, and I think if I can say something about writing for Pelican, you know, there's something really fantastic about teaching, making your ideas as clear as possible that does translate into writing for an imprint like Pelican, which is, you know, properly conceived a university for the general public. So as a result of teaching and thinking about the subject, I thought, well, there is something to be said to, if we look again at the Russian Revolution. Russia is, you know, much less of a superpower. It's definitely a regional power and a menacing one to its neighbouring states as we see today. And it seemed to me that it was a good opportunity to look at the Russian Revolution in the longue durée as an arc, because it is now genuinely history despite its afterlife, and it is genuinely a completed cycle despite its afterlife. And if you look at it as one arc, then some things come into relief. Most books, most short books on the Russian Revolution, they circle around the years 1917. That always struck me as an artificial sort of construct. My own big book on the Russian Revolution, A People's Tragedy, went back to 1891, and that's when I decided to start this. Because it does seem to me that the famine crisis of that year, which mobilized and politicized Russian society against the autocracy, was the beginning of a revolutionary crisis. You had writers like Tolstoy and Chekhov giving up their literary careers temporarily to help in the relief campaign. You had professionals, Chekhov himself, a doctor, throwing themselves into their work to help the people. You had Zemstvas and other local bodies calling for more representation in national government. You had political parties forming. You had Marxism emerging, arguably for the first time in Russia in the 1890s, as a way of trying to understand how it could have been that Russia's fiscal policies and program of industrialization had led to such impoverishment of the ordinary people. So populism is now almost supplanted by Marxism as the dominant way of thinking about modernization and the crises that brings about. So that's when I had no doubt about starting it, but it also seemed to me that actually, in many ways, the Russian Revolution doesn't end until 1991, and it would be useful to look at that arc as one, okay, neat, but actually intellectually cogent cycle of exactly 100 years. And that's not often done. I mean, if you look at the books written on the Russian Revolution, I can't actually find one that goes all the way to 91 as a revolution. Historians tend to, and political scientists tend to think of the Russian Revolution as a phase followed by the regime, a stable regime. And of course, in the 70s and 80s and 90s, people thought of the revolution as something that would have to come to an end at some point, just as we think of the French Revolution as something that came to an end, I don't know, Thermidor, Napoleon's accession to be emperor, whatever, whenever you want to call it, there's a point at which you think a revolution ends, and then it becomes the consolidation of a new system. And that's the way people tended to think about the Soviet Union and the Russian Revolution. So some books, like my own on People's Tragedy, ended 1924 when Lenin dies. Others ended earlier, 1921, when the Bolsheviks emerged victorious from the Civil War. Some people ended it in 1927 with the defeat of the left opposition and Trotsky. Others in 1929 with the launching of the five-year plan, or 1932 with the idea that, you know, Soviet industrialization was the outcome of the Russian Revolution, and you're then into a phase you call the Soviet system, which is stable. And let's not forget, as late as 1987, 8, 9, it looked quite stable. People thought it was going to last. Certainly when I started studying Russian history in the early 1980s, it looked like this was forever, until it was gone. So that was the sort of thinking that determined the writing of the Russian Revolution as one phase, and then there's a system. And I think that I don't think people then looked at it again because everyone was so bored and tired of it all. But as I say, I think throwing it into the relief of 100 years, trying to understand the revolution of that arc as a revolution, as a project, a utopian project, a project in human engineering, a project in social reconstruction, a project in literally thinking you're going to have a global revolution and a workers' paradise. That is the ideology, and it's an ideology taken seriously by the leaders. That ideology, in revolutionary form, continues right through till 91, I would argue. Of course they lose belief. Of course the population becomes increasingly cynical. But if you look at it as a revolution and you try and understand the motives of the Soviet leaders as still furthering the revolution, still carrying on Lenin's work, then some of their policies and thinking becomes clearer, I think. And I don't have time to expand on that. I'm sure we can discuss it. Within that cycle, I think I would draw your attention to what I in the book call 3 generational phases. And in some sense, it's the life, you know, it's the birth, life, and death of the Russian Revolution. And in some ways, I would argue that all revolutions probably have that natural cycle. I think it's very difficult for a revolution to continue for more than 3 generations. The first generation is essentially that of the old Bolsheviks, who emerged from this 19th century world of European Marxism and apply it in Russia, and apply it bringing Russian terrorist ideas, Jacobin ideas from the populist movement of assassinating leaders and trying to spark a putsch through popular revolt, and are able to do so because of the huge cataclysm of the First World War. And then they begin to improvise and try to make a new society, scratch their heads and realize this is all going to be much more difficult than we thought because we don't have a proletariat, we have a peasantry. And they are then supplanted by the second generation, the Stalin generation. That generation of the old Bolsheviks, if they haven't already died out, are finally eliminated by Stalin in 1937, the year of the Great Terror. But the new generation of Stalin is essentially the stable generation of the Soviet system. And it's a generation that comes from rather humble working-class peasant origins, is promoted through this huge state infrastructure that the Stalinist industrialization program creates. They take the jobs of the old Bolshevik generation, and they consolidate their position in the war, and the defense of that system, at whatever cost, becomes their raison d'etre. They still believe in the revolution, they still believe that Stalinism is continuing the revolution, but it's the consolidation of a system. And the third generation, I think, is marked from the Khrushchev secret speech of 1956, denouncing the cult of the personality, which is, you know, the only acceptable way in which someone who was deeply complicit in the Stalinist system and still a member of the Politburo, the leader of the party that had carried all this out, could try to exonerate themselves and separate where the party should be going now from what had happened under Stalin. But the denunciation of Stalin's crimes creates a sort of moral crisis of authority for the system. And it also creates within the leadership and within the sort of growing technocracy upon which it's based, a new generation of idealists and reformists, many of them, like Gorbachev, in 1956, newly graduated as a law student from Moscow University, who came from families that had been repressed under Stalin, as Gorbachev's was, and who nonetheless believed that the system could be made to work. Gorbachev, in a sense, was the last genuine Leninist idealist. And his reforms do carry on from Khrushchev's idea of Leninist renewal. But at the same time as within the system, this new generation ultimately the last is emerging, there's a really important generation gap emerging within Soviet society as in general. Because if you think about what's happened under Stalin and then the war, you've got this big gap of people, you know, by the late 1950s, early 1960s, there's very few people still alive who can remember the Russian Revolution as adults. They've been wiped out by the terror and the war. You don't have many people already in their 30s and 40s. I mean, it's, you know, demographically, it's been squeezed by those losses of male members of the families. And you have a boom, the Soviet baby boomers. You have a very young generation coming of age in the thaw, in the 60s, and they're not interested in politics anymore. They can't remember the October Revolution, obviously, and they're certainly not particularly interested in the war. And they're interested in material things. They're interested in the West because it delivers jazz, rock, jeans, the whole thing. And the system after that is essentially redefining communism not as sacrifice for the goal of world revolution, it's redefining communism, as the party program of 1961 does, as abundance for everybody. It's giving our economic promises, IOUs, to this generation to sustain belief that it can come about. Well, we all know what happened. There's economic stagnation. It carries on for reasons I can discuss with you in question, but basically oil prices and the inheritance of fear suffocating opposition, and finally collapses under Gorbachev. Okay. At that point, as I say, we all thought Russian Revolution over. But actually, what we've seen under Putin shows that its legacies are still very much there. And to understand that, we need to realize what happened to Russia in the 1990s. And it's important for us to realize it because in many ways the West really did let Russia down. Breakneck privatization at a time of hyperinflation ruined those who had taken the tokens to give them a stake in the new privatized industries. The loans for shares schemes by which the West basically, the Russian government, desperate to pay its employees to win an election when it looked like the communists might come back to power through the ballot box, ended up with enriching the few who are now the oligarchs. The biggest of the oligarchs. So capitalism and democracy for the mass of Russians looked like a really bad deal. They lost out an awful lot. They lost out a lot of security. They lost a lot of pride in their country, which had lost its superpower status. They were ideologically adrift. And moreover, they had their own Democrats are more annoyingly, foreign historians, myself included, lecturing them about how bad their history was. And that was not how they had been taught in their schools. That was not how they had been taught to think by the whole propaganda machine of the Soviet system, which is take pride in the Great October Socialist Revolution, take pride in the Great Patriotic War, take pride in Sputnik, etc. We created a modern industrial, technologically advanced state, mass education, etc., etc. So when Putin comes along and starts telling the population, you don't need to feel bad about your history, we must take pride in our revolutionary legacy, people relate to that. They relate to it in nationalist terms because they feel resentment towards the West for everything that's happened to their system since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and they don't like